How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nunvav, Daf 56 of Masechet Chullin. Friends, today's an exciting day because we're moving on to birds. Pretty exciting. You know, I went to a chicken shechita last week. Now, the thing is, I was a little bit, it would be better, I guess, if it was this week or next week even, right? Because we were mamash right in the middle of the animal stuff. I was ill prepared for birds. You know, I knew a little bit about the defects and the Kurkevan shtickle, but now we're really getting into birds. So now I'm really ready for a chicken shechita. Akoponim. So we're going to be talking about birds. We're going to have an elu trefis for birds. We're going to learn that Mishnah today, and we're going to already get up to the next Mishnah, which, just like by the animals, is followed by elu ksheris. Friends, the sugyas we are going to be studying and exploring are when a weasel bites a bird in its head. Friends, what do you think happens when a weasel bites a bird in its head? We're going to find out. When a bird falls into a fire, what happens then? Can you shecht and eat the bird afterwards? And finally, kosher defects of a bird, right? When there are defects in a bird, but they are kosher. So, right, just like we learned about by animals, there are defects in birds that nishgeferlich, the bird is nonetheless kosher. So, friends, this is what we have to look forward to on Daf Nunvav Masechet Chullin. I hope you'll join me. I hope you'll enjoy it with me, and let's go get it. Friends, we begin on Daf Nunvav Amid Aleph on the third line of the Daf at the Mishnah. Ve'elu trefis ba'of, and these are the trefas when it comes to a bird. Nikuva saveshet, ufsuka sagargeres, so similar to an animal. So in general, we're going to see that there's a klal. We're going to see a klal later on in the Gemara. I'll read it to you now. Trefas shamanu chacham bebehema kenegdan ba'of. That in principle, the trefas that there are by an animal, there also are by a bird. For example, I don't know, piercing the heart, would be a treifa by an animal and by a bird. Only when it comes to things that for whatever reason the Mishnah felt it was worth reiterating when it comes to birds, so those are reiterated here. Rashi explains what needs reiterating by the esophagus and the trachea. What needs reiterating is that, of course, we know that by a bird, you only need to shecht one of the two simanim. By an animal, you have to shecht the trachea and the esophagus. By a bird, one is sufficient. One suffices. And therefore, I might think, okay, there's less vitality in a bird. You only need to shecht one of the simanim. So maybe also, since there is less vitality in a bird, maybe simply puncturing the trachea would be enough to make it a treifa. By an animal, we say that the animal is treif if a majority of the trachea is broken through. Then it's treif. But maybe by a bird, which has less vitality, maybe even a puncture is enough to make a puncture of the trachea would be enough to make it a treifa. So therefore, the Mishnah needs to teach us that no, the same halacha applies to a bird, that when it comes to the trachea, we're talking about if more than half of it has been slit already, has been broken through, it is a treifa. And since it mentioned the trachea, it also mentioned the esophagus. Okay, so again, ve'elu trefis ba'of, these are the treifas of a boyd. And nikuva saveshet, if there is a puncture in the esophagus, just like by a animal. And also ufsuka sagargeres, if the trachea is split already more than halfway. Hikata chulda al rosha, if a weasel, remember a weasel is like this little animal. I think a weasel might be the smallest carnivore, which I guess you can imagine why people like, a weasel, I feel like has a reputation of like, a weasel, like, only a weasel would do that, something, because you have these weasels, they're like these tiny little like squirrel, they're like the size of a squirrel, and yet they'll like attack a chicken, or they're carnivores, and they'll, you have this little thing, and it's like, and it's attacking, different other things. Like, what a weasel. So, ikata chulda al rosha. So if a weasel attacked a chicken on its head, and it bit the chicken's head, Makom sha'osa osa treifa, in a location on the head that would make the chicken treif. Where is a location on the head that would make the chicken treif? Its brains. If a weasel bit a chicken in its head by its brains, so now what happens? So we're going to talk about, we're going to go straight into that in the Gemara, what we do in that case. Nikeb a Kurkevan. If the Heilige Kurkevan is punctured, the Heilige Kurkevan, that's like a thing, the Heilige Kurkevan. I think there's a lot of different stories about the Heilige Kurkevan, a lot of different versions. I found out about it a few weeks ago. I went to my friend's house for a Shabbos Suda. He ended up not being there, but his brother was there. We were schmoozing. We were just talking and learning for a few hours. I'm happy to do that. So we were schmoozing, and he told me this story. I don't remember exactly how. I'll tell you. I think the version that I heard from him ish. I can't remember exactly how he told it over. I think there's different versions of it. But basically, so there's some Rav, a young Rav. He's learning in yeshiva his whole life, and he gets. I don't know. Maybe he's in his young 20s. He's a young Rav. And he gets smicha, and they send him to be the rav of a town, of a certain town. And then, at the beginning of his tenure, a lady comes by, a woman comes by with her chicken, and she has a shaila about the chicken, if it's kosher or not. And she shows him the Kurkevan of the chicken to see if it's kosher. And he looks at it and he says, this is the Heilige Kurkevan. So Kolponim, he'd been learning about it his whole life, and finally, the Heilige Kurkevan, he was able to rule a halacha about it. So, the Heilige Kurkevan. So Nikev a Kurkevan, if the Heilige Kurkevan is punctured, Nikvu adakin, if the intestines got punctured, Nafla leor ve'nechmeru bnei me'el, if the bird fell into a fire and its intestines got singed, got scorched. Im yerukim psulim, if they are green, they are pasul. We're going to learn about there's a little bit more nuance here, but if they are green, they are pasul. Madumim kshem, if they are red, they are kosher. Darsa vitarfa bakosel, so this is not talking about a wolf injecting poison in a chicken. This is talking about if a person stepped on a bird, intentionally, unintentionally, whatever it is, but if the bird got trampled on, right? The issue here is not like Derusa in the previous Mishnah about the claws and the venom. The issue here is essentially the equivalent of naflim and agag, is risuk evarim, of a concussion of the limbs. That if the bird got trampled on, got stepped on, vitarfa bakosel, like we learned in this week's parsha with Bilam. Bilam was riding on his donkey to go to Moab, and the donkey sees the angel standing on the road, and there are fences on either side, and the Bilam doesn't see the angel, but the donkey does. And the donkey tries to veer out of the way of the angel, and he crushes Bilam's leg into the fence, and Bilam was not very happy about that. So anyways, vitarfa bakosel, if a bird gets hit against the wall, shiritzatsta behema, or that an animal hit it, umifarkeses, attacked it, umifarkeses, and it's flapping around, v'shasa me'es leis, and it remained alive for 24 hours, right, which is the halacha by nafla min agag. You can't shecht it immediately. You got to give it 24 hours to make sure it's still alive 24 hours later. V'shachat hakshera, if at that point, after 24 hours, after you've proven that it is not imminently dying, and it lives for 24 hours, then you can shecht it and it is kosher. Although you would have to do a bedika, you'd have to check and make sure that, for example, the spinal cord is intact. Okay, fine. That was the Mishnah of Elu Trefis in the context of a bird. Now says the Gemara, the Gemara is now going to be discussing the weasel biting the head of the chicken. And the concern is, when I say it's really birds, any birds that we can eat. But I think I just automatically go to chicken because that's just the most common bird, I think, right? Akaponim. So we are going straight to the weasel biting the chicken in the head. And the concern there is that the weasel will puncture the skull with its teeth and puncture through the skull into the brain. And as we remember from animals, brains have two membranes, an outer thicker membrane and an inner thinner membrane. There was a machlokes about if puncturing the outer membrane alone is enough to make the animal, or in this case a bird, a treifa, or does the puncture need to be through both, through the outer and inner layers? But anyways, the concern here is that the weasel bit through the skull of the chicken and pierced through the membrane or membranes, that'll be part of the discussion of the brain. Rav Shmuel and Levi the Amrit, that they said, how do you test it? What do you do? What's the test? Right? So a weasel attacked the chicken, bit it in the head, and now we don't know, is the membrane of the brain punctured or not? How are you supposed to tell? This is how you tell. This is how you tell. Machlis yodo lifnim, you stick your finger into the chicken's mouth. I assume that this is probably after you shecht it to see if it's a treifa. So you stick your finger into the chicken's mouth, uvodek, and you check it. How do you check it? You stick your finger in the chicken's mouth and you push up. You push up on the palate. And pushing up on the palate is going to apply pressure to the brain. In mivatzbeitz ba'ola treifa. And if brains start squishing out of the skull, then it's treif. Then that means that the membrane that the brain is in is punctured. If you're applying pressure, so you stick the finger in the mouth of the bird, and you're applying pressure upwards, and brain starts squishing out of the skull, well, that membrane, those membranes have been punctured. Ve'im lav, but if no brains are squishing out of the skull, kshera, the bird is kshera because the membranes are intact. Umar ad diminakev karma tatoya. Well, this test is all fine and good according to the view that both membranes need to be pierced when we're talking about a treifa by piercing into the brain. So we talk about an animal, or in this case a bird, being treif when the nikva krum hamoyach. So if we say that that's talking about where both membranes have been pierced, this is great, amazing. Stick your finger in the mouth of the chicken, apply pressure upwards, and see if the brains squish out of the holes. Elamanda Omar inkiv iloya afagavdelo inkiv tatoya. I think it might be inakav, maybe. Let's go with that. Inakev iloya afapi delo inakev tatoya. But what about, according to the opinion, that even just piercing through the outer membrane is enough to render, in this case, a chicken? Right? We're talking about chickens here, so I probably don't need to always say animal or chicken. We're talking about chickens, we're talking about birds. So, according to the opinion who says that even if simply the outer membrane was pierced, it would already be a treifa, then that means that it's treif even if the inner membrane is intact. Now, if the inner membrane is sealed and intact, this experiment will produce a false negative. You'll apply pressure on the brain, and no brains will squish out, and yet it will still be treif. You'll think it's kosher because no brains squished out, but the fact of the matter is it's treif because the outer layer is punctured. Shouldn't we be concerned that maybe the outer layer is punctured? Tatoya lo inakev, but the lower, thinner membrane, the inner membrane, is still intact, which is what's preventing the brains from squishing out, but yet it's still treif. And for the Gemara, iso de inakev iloya tatoya agav rukche mi poka poka. Here's the thing. The inner membrane is a very thin membrane. It's very weak, very thin. If the outer membrane was pierced and pressure was applied on the brains, you can be sure that brains would be squishing out of that hole in the outer membrane, i.e., it would the pressure would burst a hole in the lower thinner membrane, and brains would start squishing out of the skull. So therefore, it's a valid test either way. Either way, if the outer membrane of the brain has been pierced, this test will produce results. Omer Zeiri says, Zeiri, Ein bedika l'chulda. There is no possibility, says Zeiri, of doing any kind of a treifa bedika when it comes to a weasel. If a weasel bites a chicken in the head, it's treif. There's no way to check, which obviously is unlike we just talked about a very interesting experiment for how to check. But says Zeiri, a weasel bites a chicken in the head. Unfortunately, there is no way to check. You have to throw it in the garbage. Mipnei shashinea dakos. The reason is because it's the teeth of the weasel are very sharp and very thin. And the way I understand it is that the teeth are so thin that the hole will be so thin that there's, even the experiment, even the test that we just mentioned, the hole will be too thin for any brains to squish out. But wait, but who cares if its teeth are so sharp and thin? I mean, ultimately, I would think that the brains would squish out anyways. So Amar Rav Oshai says, va'akumos. It's more than just that they are thin and sharp, they are also crooked, which means that what happens is this weasel will bite through the skull and puncture the skull. But what we're concerned about is that it's then going to continue and puncture the brain. The thing is that because the teeth of the weasel are not just sharp and thin, but they're also crooked, so the hole that would be in the brains would be misaligned with the hole in the skull, right? It's not like there would be a straight line, a hole in the skull, right underneath that, a hole in the outer membrane, right underneath that, a hole in the inner membrane. No, because the teeth of the weasel are crooked, the hole in the membranes of the brain will be misaligned with the hole in the skull, and therefore this test will not work, because what's going to happen is as you apply pressure to the brain, it's going to push the brain up against the skull. The thing is, where it's pushing up against the skull is not where the hole is. So basically the skull is just going to end up blocking and covering the hole in the brains, preventing any brains from squishing out, so you're going to have a false negative. Right? If all the holes were aligned, fine, I understand how applying pressure on the brain would squish them out through the holes. But if the brains are not aligned, basically the skull is just going to end up sealing, essentially, the punctures in the membranes, and no brains are going to squish out. So again, Amar Rav Oshai says, Shinei dakos va'akumos. The teeth of the weasel are not just sharp, but they are crooked. And therefore, basically the skull is just going to cover the hole in the brains, and you're going to get false negatives. Ki solik linardoya. Now, when Zeiri went to Nardoya, Shalach lehu, Zeiri sent back to. So I mean, what does Rashi say? What does Rashi say? Ki solik linardoya. Where are we? Come on, hurry up. Yeah, come on. What? Yeah, okay. Oh, great. Because look, Zeiri mi Babble and Arda. Right, very interesting. Rashi says mi Babble and Arda. So I mean, Babel, I believe, was also a city in Babel. There was a place called Babel in Babel. So Rashi says he went from Babel to Nardaya. It's interesting it says Kisalik when he went up. Usually go up to Eretz Yisrael. Here he's going to Nardoah. But anyways, but fine, he went from Babble to Nardoah, which is where Shmuel lived, Rav Nachman lived. Anyways, so Zeiri, so Kisalik to Nardoah, when he went to Nardoah, Shalachlu, he sent back to the people in Babble where he came from. Right? Because he had just said that there's no way to test a weasel bite in the brains. When he sent back to Babble what I said to you about the weasel brains, Tohu saying biyadi, I was mistaken. This is what they say in the name of Rish Lakish. Bodkin, I assume that Nardoah is talking about Babble, although it's interesting that we're talking about a machlokes in Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. I don't know. It's interesting, right? Because we say Kisalik when he went up, and we're talking about Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish who were in Eretz Yisrael. I don't know. Anyways, so they said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, so Rish Lakish, right? Kachamar Amr Mishmei de Reb Shimon ben Lakish. They said in the name of Reb Shimon ben Lakish, Bodkin lechulda biyad. So Rish Lakish is saying that taka, when you have a weasel bite in the skull, you do the test that we described earlier. You apply pressure to the brain and see if brains squish out. Avalo b'masmer, but you don't use a nail. What does it mean to use a nail? Basically, the nail test would be that you open up the skull and then take a nail to very gently and carefully kind of glide it on the brain where the wound would be, where the puncture would be, and see if it gets stuck. See if it hits a snag. If it hits a snag, then that's a puncture. So it says Rish Lakish, we don't do the nail test. We do the finger pushing up test. We don't do the nail test. Rabbi Yochanan Amar af b'masmer. Rabbi Yochanan says you can also do the nail test. That is not a problem. Plukta de Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia, and this aligns with a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Chad badik biyada, one of them would test weasel bites with his hand, applying pressure to the brain via the mouth. V'chad badik b'machta, and the other would check with a needle, which is the equivalent of a nail, basically carefully gliding a needle along the brain and seeing if it's a snag. Man de badik biyada omerle leman de badik b'machta. So the one who would test by applying pressure on the brain would chide the said to the one who tested with the needle, Ad mosai ato mechala mamoinon shel Yisrael. The one who would do the hand test said to the one who did the needle test, you're wasting the money of the Yidden, because the needle test is risky in that if you're not very careful, you may create that puncture yourself with your needle. And therefore, says the hand test, Tana, to the needle test, Tana, you are causing people unnecessarily to lose money because you're going to find holes in the membrane that you yourself created by the needle that you're using to check it. Omarle, to which the needle Tana responded, Man debadik b'machta, man debadik b'yada, ad mosai ata machil yisol nevelis. Well, you, my friend, are feeding the yid in nevelis, as we described earlier. Since the teeth of the weasel are on an angle, the pressure to the brain test will result in false negatives, that the brain will get covered by the skull because the hole in the brain will not be aligned with the hole in the skull. So when you apply pressure to the brain, it's just going to get blocked by the skull where the hole is not, and no brains are going to squish out, but it is in fact treifa. Nevelis, wait, why are you saying that? Well, why is he saying that anybody's potentially feeding nevelis? Shachata. We're not talking about nevela, we're talking about treifa. Or why is he saying that? Well, you are feeding nevela to people. Nevela, we're talking maximum. It's treifa, not nevela. The difference is nevela is tameh, treifa is not. So Ella, Trephis. Okay, fine. You're feeding trephis to people. Okay, fine. Shema nikev krum shamayach, out of concern of the fact that maybe the membrane of the brain is in fact punctured, but no brains are squishing out because it's being blocked by the skull since the holes are misaligned. Tistayim de Rabbi Yehuda hu debadik biyada. Let us conclude that Rabbi Yehuda, right? This was machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. We said that one of them says you test by applying pressure. The other one says you test with a needle. Let's conclude that Rabbi Yehuda is the one who would test with his finger, the one who would test by applying pressure to the brain and see if anything squishes out. Desani, we learn in a brayso of Shimon ben Elazar Omer Mishum Rabbi Yehuda Botkin lechulda biyad, that we check out weasel bites with our hands by applying pressure to the brain, abalo b'masber, but not with a nail that is too risky. You may cause the puncture yourself. Nishbar etzem. Now the brisa continues with something peculiar, that if the skull breaks, ap al pi shelo nikav krum shamach, even if the membranes of the brain are intact, it is nonetheless treif. Tistayim, we'll get back to the Seifa in a second, but Tistayim, okay, fine, we see based on the Reisha that it is in fact Rabbi Yehuda who says that you would check the weasel bite by applying pressure to the brain. Fine. Now, Hagufa Kasha, one second, I don't understand this brisa. On the one hand, we're quoting Rabbi Yehuda as saying that if the skull is, if a weasel bites through the skull, and we need to check the brain, so you can check the brain, apply pressure to the brain, see if anything squishes out. But then we say right after that in the same brisa that if the skull is crushed, then the bird is automatically a treifa. What is it? What I understand? The Reisha is talking about how you check to see if it's a treifa, and the Seifa is saying it's automatically a treifa. So what are we checking for in the Reisha then? I don't understand. Hagufa Kasha, on the one hand, Omar Botkin lechulda biyad. On the one hand, the brisa starts off by saying that if we have a weasel bite on the skull, so this is how you test it out, by applying pressure to the brain with your finger. Avalob masmer, just don't use a nail. Alma isle b'dikusa. So we see that by a weasel bite, there is a way to check it. But v'hadar tani, but then it says in the Seifa, nishbar etzem, that no, if the skull breaks, af al pi shelo nikev krum shamayach, even if the membrane of the brain is intact, it doesn't matter. It's treif. Alma leis lebdikusa, which therefore means that there is no way to check. There is no way to test it out. And that if the skull is broken by a weasel, it's automatically treif. Seifa saw in the Ov Shamayim. The Seifa where it says that if the skull is broken, the Seifa where it says that if the skull is broken, it's automatically treif, that is a water bird. That is a aqua, what's the word here? I don't know. A aqua, I use the word later. I don't know if it necessarily makes sense. Aquatic bird. I don't know if that's the right word. But okay, that's talking about an aquatic bird, a bird that lives in water. However, ein lem krum, they don't have brain membranes. Ein lem krum? What do you mean they don't have brain membranes? Sagadatich ela ho'il v'krumo rach. No, it just means that their membranes of their brains are very soft, such that when it comes to these aquatic birds, if their skull gets broken, well then the membranes of their brain are definitely going to get pierced as well. Even if they aren't now, they're going to. And therefore, there really is no point of doing any bedika. If we're talking about aquatic birds, if the skull is broken, so then automaticely it's a treifa because their brain membranes are too soft. Amalei Rav Nachman, the Rav Anon, says Rav Nachman to Rav Anon. Mar Amar, you told us, it says Rav Nachman to Rav Anon, you told us, Shmuel badak biyada umechasher, that Shmuel, when it came to weasel bites of the skull, he would check with his finger, he would stick the finger in the mouth, apply pressure to the brain, see if anything squishes out, and if not, he would say it's kosher. V'huna chavin, and our friend Rav Huna, Amar Rab badik biyada umechasher, that Rab did the same thing. that he would check with his hand, see if brains squish out. If not, kosher. But it says of Nachman, I don't understand. Vatani Levi, but didn't Levi teach? Trefis Shemanu Chachamim Bebehema Kinegedon Ba'of. That Levi says, Levi had his own brises, and in his brises he taught that the trefis that we listed by animals apply as well to birds, right? For whatever organs and limbs overlap between birds and animals, their respective trefis will also overlap. Yasser alein of, but there's an additional one by a bird, nishbar etzem afal pishlo nikev krum shamayach, that says Levi teaches that by birds, if the skull is broken, even if the membrane is intact, it is treif. So why are Rav and Shmuel testing with the pressure test? Amalei, to which Rav Anan responds, Hahu be'ov shamayim, that's talking about an aquatic bird, hoel ve'ein lo krum, since it doesn't have any membrane on its brain. Ein lo krum sakadayatich? What do you mean it doesn't have any membrane on its brain? Ella hoil v'krumo rach. No, its membrane, the membrane of its brain is very soft, and therefore if the skull breaks, it's automatically treif. Ha'u tanagolto, there was a chicken, Da'avoy bei Rav Chana, that was by Rav Chana, Shadra l'kami de Rav Masna, and he sent this chicken to Rav Masna, Nishbar ha'etzem, and the skull was broken, V'lo nikev krum shomayach, the skull was broken, but the membranes were intact. Havoy. That's what kind of chicken this was. V'achshira. And Rav Masna said it is kosher. Amalei Rav Chana says, V'atani Levi, but didn't Levi teach treifis shemanu chacham b'behem connecting ba'of, that whatever treifis apply to animals, we apply them as well to birds wherever they overlap. Yasser alein of nishbar etzem al bishlo nikev krum shamaya. And that Rav Levi then says that when it comes to birds, if the skull is broken, even if the membranes of the brain are intact, it's still treif. So why are you telling me that this chicken is kosher? So Amalei Rav Masna says, Hasan b'ov shomayim, there that's talking about aquatic birds, ha'ol ve'ein lo krum, since they don't have any membranes on their brain. Ein lo krum sagadadik, what do you mean they don't have any membranes on their brain? Ela ema hoil ve'krumo rach, since the membrane on their brain is soft. So we just saw a few versions of basically that concept, that there's a distinction between aquatic birds and other birds. When it comes to aquatic birds, the membranes of their brain are very soft, and if the skull breaks, so then the membranes will either are broken or will break, and the bird is a treifa. Rav Shezvi Bodik b'shimsha, Rav Shezvi would check for punctures in the brain membrane by in the sun. He would go out to a sunny spot to look for any punctures. Rav Yemer Bodik b'maya, Rav Yemer would check with water. There's I think two versions of that. One version is that he would basically empty out the brain membrane, because basically the spinal cord kind of goes out of the brain. So like where the spinal cord goes out, he would I guess like empty out the brain through that hole, and then he would fill up the membrane with water and see if any water leaks out. Alternatively, he would fill up the skull with water and see if the water is getting like murky and white and stuff. If so, then that means that the brains are leaking out. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Bodik begila dechitza. Rav Acha bar Yaakov would check with a strand of, with like a stalk of wheat, almost like in the same way that with the needle and the nail. So he would use like a stalk of wheat to look for any nags. Amr of Shezvi, says of Shezvi, Hane avaze didan kov shomayim damyon. I don't know if that's geese or ducks. Let's see. Well, let's see if I can find this quickly. Our geese. Interesting, because the other day we had I don't know if it was avaza or bar avaza. It was translated as ducks, but here this is geese. Our geese, they're considered like aquatic birds, and therefore if their skulls are crushed, we would automatically assume them to be treif. So now we move on to the next part of the Mishnah where we discuss nafla la'or, where we discuss where a bird fell into a fire and its intestines got scorched. So then we talked about if they're green, so then they are treif. So we're gonna discuss exactly what this means. Amar Reb Yochanan says Reb Yochanan Mishum Reb Yosi ben Yoshua. Shir Yerukasan Shir Nikuvasan, that when we talk about if there are green spots on the intestines or on the inner organs, so those green spots are the same size of a puncture, i.e., manikuvasan b'mashu, just like when we talk about, puncturing a lung or puncturing the heart, for example. So that puncture is a mashu. So after yerukasan b'mashu, so when we talk about where a green spot is going to be an issue, it is even a mashu, any size, even a small amount of greenness where there should not be greenness is going to be treif. Ba'amine Rav Yosef Brei Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Horika kaved keneged bnei me'aimau. What if the liver gets a green spot on it opposite the intestines? Right? In a bird, I think it's like a bit messy inside of a bird. I think inside of an animal, it's a lot more organized, I think. Inside of a bird, I think it's a bit of a mess. Anyways, so the liver is like in there, like with all the intestines and stuff. And so if the liver develops a green spot opposite the intestines, is it treif or not? Amar Lei, Rabbi Shimon Levi says treifa. It's treif. V'lo yeh ela nitla. But one second, as we know, by the liver, right? We said from Levi earlier that according to Levi, the same treifas that apply to animals apply to birds. By the liver can be missing. Sure, right? There was a whole shaila. Is it less than a kazayas that needs to remain, or more than kazayas, or up to kazayas, whatever it is. But certainly, if we just view, right, there are some dots on the liver, so why don't we just treat those dots like, let's just assume like they don't exist at all. If they didn't exist at all, that would be kosher, right? Right, a little bit of the liver is missing, that's fine. So why are we saying that the animals that the bird is treif? Because it has a dot on it. Just pretend like the dot isn't there at all, it'll be fine. So Marava says Rava came into Orika Kaved Kineged Bnei Mayim. I'll tell you why. Because a green dot on the liver opposite the intestines is an indication. Why is there a green spot on the liver? It's an indication that the bird fell into a fire and that its intestines got singed, and that is being represented by this green dot on the liver. So it's not that a green dot on the liver is inherently an issue. Sure, we could just view it like it doesn't exist, but it's an indication that this bird fell into a fire and that it is treif. Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Rabbi Shua ben Levi had a chicken. Shadr lekame d'Rabelazar a kaper bribi, and Rabbi Shua ben Levi sent this chicken to Rabelazar a kaper the gadol ador, says Rashi. Amalei Yerukin havu, and Rabbi Shua ben Levi says that this bird, its intestines are green. The achsha, right? So meaning Rabbi Shua ben Levi says that this bird's intestines are green. The achsha, and Rabbi Elazar Kapper says that it's kosher. V'anatanan Yerukim Psulim, but says Rabbi Shua ben Levi, didn't we say in our Mishnah that green spots are possible? So friends, listen up. Here's the distinction. I mentioned in the Mishnah that there's a little bit of subtlety. Here's the subtlety. It's not hard. It's just here's the subtlety. Lo amru Yerukim Psulin ela bekurkevan belev v'kovid. It depends. What do the Kurkevan, the heart, and the liver all have in common? They're all a darkish reddish color. On the inner organs that have a darkish reddish color, so it is a green spot that is going to, right, the green spots are going to be an indication of typhus. For those reddish organs, red is not an issue. So when the Mishnah had said, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah, he had said, Yirukim psulim imadumim ksherim, that if they are green, it's possible. If it's red, it's kosher. It's because we're talking about these internal organs that are supposed to be red. The Kurkevan, the liver, the heart. Right, so the lo amar and ella. Right, so where am I? So lo amar and Yerukim psulin ella bekurkevan belev uvchavet. Tananami also we also learn in a brisa like this. Be'elu b'nei me'ayim amru bekurkevan belev uvchavet. That when we're talking about green spots being treif by the inner organs, we're talking about the Kurkevan, the heart, and the liver. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef avleu tanagolta. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef had a chicken. Shaja the commander of Babble, and he said to Babble, the Amarle, and he says to Babble, Adumin havu. That there are red spots on the intestines. V'tarfa. And Babble said that this bird is treif. V'anatanan adumin kshem. But didn't we say in our Mishnah that red spots are kosher? So similarly, Amarle, Babble says, Adumin sheoriku v'yirukin she'adimu treifa. Red organs that became green, or green organs that became red, are treif. Lo amra adumin ksherim, when the Mishnah says that red is kosher, that's ela belev v'kurkevan uvekavid. In the heart, in the kurkevan, in the liver, these are red organs, so green is an indication of typhus. But by the intestines, which are yellowish, greenish, it will be a red dot that is an indication of typhus. Amrab Shmuel bar Chia, Amrab Mani, Adumin Shaoriku. If you have, let's say, the liver that becomes green, Vishalkan, but you cooked it, Vichazru Ve'adimu, and the green went away, and it's all red, Ksherin, so then the bird is kosher, it's not treif. My time, how come? Kutra Ayalbahu. Well, the fact that when you cooked it, the green went away, it's an indication that that green was not real green, it was just smoke that changed its color. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Af Onan Nomar, so let's also say that adumin, right, that it works both ways. Adumin shelo oriku, vishalkon ve'oriku, treifa. Well, we'll say the same thing, that if you have, let's say, a liver that's red and it looks good, and now you cook it and it becomes green, so also we'll say that it's treif, my time igloi ba'asayu, because by cooking it, you revealed its shame. By cooking it, you revealed that in fact it had a green spot all along. So therefore, essentially it works both ways. If you have a liver or a heart or a kurkevan that has a green spot and it looks like it's going to be treif, if you cook it and this green spot goes away, that will be an indication it's not a real green spot. It's just caused by smoke. And the same, it works the same. It works also the other way, which is that if you have a heart, a liver, a kurkevan that looks healthy, and then you cook it, and all of a sudden it reveals a green spot, it is going to be treif. Amar of Ashi says of Ashi, Hilkach lo lechol inish ela bishilka. So it says of Ashi, well, if that's the case, well then any bird that falls in a fire, we should have to cook the organs in order to confirm that even if they look, let's say the heart looks like it's all red, you don't see any green, we should have to cook it because maybe it will reveal green. To which the Gemara says, Veloi achzuke reyesa lo machzikin. The Gemara says, no, you don't need to do that. You don't need to go out cooking the organs, looking for a psul, looking for to find something that's going to make it treif. A reyesa, something that's going to make it treif. No, if you see that the heart has a green spot on it, so then cook it to see if the green spot will go away. If you don't see any green spots and you cook it anyways and then it reveals a green spot, okay, so Mimela, we have to be concerned about typhus. But if you don't see a green spot, you don't have to go looking for it and cooking it to see if maybe you're going to find one. That you don't need to do. Achzuke reyesa lo machzikinen. We don't assume that there's some kind of reyesa that we don't currently see. Darsa, v'tarfa bakosel, if somebody stepped on a bird or if it got hit against the wall. Amr Belazar ben Antigonus, Mishum Reb Elazar ben Bianai, Achazov tzricha bedika. Even though we had said in the Mishnah that if it remains alive for 24 hours, it's kosher, you still do need to check it to see if maybe the spinal cord broke, for example, and you're still going to have to do a bedika, you're still going to have to check to make sure that it is in fact kosher. After 24 hours, you don't have to worry about risuk evarim, but you still would have to do a bedika to make sure that there are no other issues with this bird that got stepped on or hit against the wall. And now we get up to a new Mishnah. The next Mishnah, Elu ve'elu ksheris ba'of, and these following scenarios are kosher when it comes to a bird. Nikva agargeres, if the trachea gets simply pierced, osha nizdika, or if it gets split lengthwise and there's a little bit that remains at the top and the bottom. In these scenarios, the bird is kosher. Hikata chulda al rosha, if a weasel bit its skull, makom she'eino osa trefa, but it's a part of the skull that would not make it a trefa, it's not by the brain. Nike hazefek, if the zefek got punctured, Rabbi Omer afilu nito. Rabbi Yosef says even if the zefek is missing. Let's take a look at the zefek. I realize also I didn't show earlier what the Kurkevan is. So let's take a look over here. Here we are looking at a chicken, kind of the digestive tract of a chicken. Basically, the second label from the left is the zefek. The way that a chicken's internals work are different than animals. Basically, the chicken eats like seeds and whatever it eats, and those seeds first stop in the zefek. That's like its first stomach, and like some initial kind of processing goes on over there. And from the zefek, it then continues on through something that's called a kevas ablutos, and from there to the Kurkevan. We've been talking about the Kurkevan earlier. I didn't point it out. We've seen it before, but that big purple circle there, that is the Kurkevan, and there the food or whatever it's eating arrives at the Kurkevan. It's already drier at that point. And I was watching a video earlier today about some guy who was like opening up a chicken so that I could see what it looks like inside, and he was pointing out that chicken don't have teeth. So basically, they just kind of like kind of whole seed or like broken seed. Maybe they break stuff with their beak, but like kind of pieces of food are kind of coming in here. And the Kurkevan has like muscle, and it like almost like acts like in some ways like it's like kind of like the teeth, kind of breaking up whatever arrives there. Anyways, and then it continues on its merry way around the digestive system. But for now, it's good to just point out the zefek, which is kind of the initial stop there on the way, and then it continues on to the Heilige Kurkevan. Okay, now says the Mishnah. So again, ve'elu ksheris ba'of nikva gargeres oy shenizdika ha o shenizdika. He kata chuda al rosha makom she'ena osa trefa. Nikev zefek. If the zefek is pierced, it's kosher. Rabbi Omer afilu nito. Rabbi says even if the zefek is gone, it's kosher. I guess it would have to be in a way that it could still digest stuff, but okay. Yatsu b'nei me'el, if its kishkis spilled out, v'lo nikvu, but they weren't punctured. If they're punctured, then it's a treifa. But if the guts kind of spilled out, I don't know how they're spilling out, but if they spilled out but are unpunctured, the bird is kosher. Nishtabru gapel, if its wing bones broke, nishtabru raglea, or its legs broke, and that means basically when you get a chicken from the store, let's say you buy chicken legs, you get those drumsticks, the pulkas. So you basically, if the drumstick at the bottom where you hold it is basically at the bottom. So there's like the round part. That's essentially the shok, right? That's like the thigh bone or the shok, whatever, the leg bone. And then so there's the round part, and then there's the bottom part where you hold it by. So you're holding it. What's there really is a joint, right? They cut off what's underneath that. That stuff's kind of nasty. It's not so appetizing. That's like the bottom part of the like the foot, basically. That's like the chicken feet under there, and it's got like so it's like that's like basically from that joint that goes down to the chicken feet. So basically, anywhere past that joint, past the polka, anywhere below that, if the legs break, then it's kosher. It's fine, no big deal. Nicht gefährlich. If the drumstick itself, if the polka itself breaks, if it's sticking out of if it pierces through the skin of the bird, of the chicken, let's say, so then it would be treif. But as long as the fracture remains in the skin, so then it is kosher. Okay. So nishtabu gabeh, if its wings broke, if its wing bones broke, nishtabu ragleh, or its legs broke, nimritu knafeh, or if it's big feathers kind of got disconnected, it is still kosher. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda, im nitla anotza psula, if the down, right, if there's like small feathers also on chickens, these like small feathers by the skin, if they are gone, says Rabbi Yehuda, that it would be treif. It would be puzzle. Tana Rabbanan the Rabbi Ma'aseh Reb Simai Reb Tzadik. There's a story of Simai and Reb Tzadik Shahalchu LaAbershanim Belud. They're on their way to Lud. Lud, I think, is where the Ben Gurion airport is. They were on their way to Lud. They were going to gather in order to determine a leap year. The Shavzu Ba'ono, and when Shabbos came, they spent Shabbos in Ono. That's the place. The Horu, and when they were there, they gave a psak halacha b'tarpachas, with regard to a womb, ki Rebbe bezefek, like Rebbe when it comes to the zefek. And the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean? Like they gave a psak halacha about a womb, like Rebbe when it comes to a zefek. Was it Horu b'tarpachas li'isura and ki Rebbe bezefek latera? Did they give two separate rulings? The first ruling being that an animal that does not have a womb is treif, and the second ruling that they gave is that the halacha is like Rebbe, that if the zefek is missing in a bird, it's kosher. So were they two separate halachas that they ruled? Or perhaps it's one halacha. Horu b'tarpachas, that they ruled about a missing womb, that it's kosher, just like Rebbe says about a zefek. Latera ki Rebbe bezefek, just like Rebbe says that a zefek that's missing is kosher, so they ruled about a womb that's missing in an animal, that the animal is kosher, just like Rebbe says about a zefek that is missing in a bird. Aval ki Rebbe bezefek lo svirlu, they don't necessarily hold like Rebbe when it comes to zefek. That was just their way of saying that an animal without a womb is kosher, in the same way that Rebbe says that a bird without a zefek is kosher, regardless of whether or not they actually hold like Rebbe. Teku, the Gemara says it's a tie. Omar Rabba, says Rabbi Vitim Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Gago shel zefek, the roof of the zefek, nidon kiveshet. Remember, the zefek, of course, is that first stomach of sorts, right? Not the Heilige Kurkevan, which is that purple circle later on. This is that first kind of stomachy looking thing. So Gago shel zefek, the roof of the zefek, nidon kiveshet, is treated like the veshet, is treated like the esophagus, in that if it gets pierced, it will be treif. Heicha, where is the roof of the zefek? Amr Beiva bar Abaye kol she nimtoch imo. So Rashi explains what this means is the part of the zefek that kind of starts kind of angling towards the esophagus, right? The esophagus is kind of thinner. The zefek is like a stomach kind of thing, and the roof of the zefek is the top part of the zefek that starts to kind of angle towards the esophagus. The Rambam defines it as any part of the zefek that, if the bird extends its neck, would kind of become right, would kind of give way towards the esophagus. Okay, so that part of the zefek has the din of the esophagus, in that if it gets punctured, it would be a treifa. Yatsu b'nei me'el, if the intestines of the bird spilled out, so we say it's kosher as long as they are not punctured. Omer Reb Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Loshanu ela shelo hipech bahen. Yeah, it's kosher as long as you didn't try to stuff them back in. I don't exactly know how this happens. I don't know how the intestines and the guts of a bird just kind of spill out. But we're saying if they spill out, the bird is still kosher as long as there's no punctures in the intestines. But be sure not to try to stuff them back in. Don't try to stuff them back in. If you try to stuff them back in, treifa, the bird is not treif. Because the pasuk says, "Hu oscha vayichon necha." The pasuk says in Parshas Azinu that he made you in like layers, like a khan is like a base, in bases. Everything, right? The intestines and the insides are layered intentionally. That each thing, each part of the inner workings of, I guess, all living beings probably, is in a particular order, and everything needs to rest on one another, and you don't want to mess with that order by stuffing everything back in. That the Rebbeinu Shalom created layers in a person, and if those layers get flipped up and everything starts getting out of order, and your liver are where your lungs are supposed to be, and your lungs are where your stomach's supposed to be, etc., that's going to be an issue. So therefore, if the guts of the bird gets spilled out, we're saying, okay, it's fine, it could still be kosher as long as there's no punctures in the intestines, but don't try to stuff it back in. Tanya, we learn in the Brisa of Reb Meir Omer, Reb Meir would say, Hu ascha vayichonenecha, Reb Meir gave a pshat on Hu ascha vayichonenecha, ki kracha dichula bei, that vayichonenecha is like a city that contains everything in it. Mimenu kohanav, the Yidden have kohanim. Mimenu neviyav, we have prophets. Mimenu sarav, mimenu malachav, we have officers. We have kings. Shenemar, mimenu pino, mimenu yosed v'gomer. It's a pasuk in Zechariah that says about Yehuda, about Judah, that they also that Judah has everything that they need. There was a certain Roman who saw a person, Dinafel Me'igra, who fell off a roof, Nebuch. Le'ara, to the ground, Poke Karse, and his Vinafuk Mayone, and his stomach and his innards, they all spilled out. So the guy was still alive. He was in very bad condition. His guts and stuff were spilled all over the road. So what do? So this Roman knew you can't try to stuff the guts back into the guy, as we just said. You're going to mess things up. So what he did was, he had an interesting solution. Asya livrei, so he brought this fellow's son, v'shachate kame ba'achuzas einaim, and he made it ki'ilu, he was slaughtering this person's son in front of him. He didn't lay a finger on him, but he made it ki'ilu, he made it look like he was slaughtering this guy's son in front of him. And when this guy saw that, Ingid the Isnach, he gave a krechts, all the mayone v'chayte the karse, and he I guess straightened up his body and he kind of moved his body, and he gave a krechts, and all of his kishkes came back inside of his body in their proper order without anybody stuffing them back in. Very, very interesting. Anyways, friends, that was Daf Nun Vav of Masechta Chullin. And Daf Nun Vav of Masechta Chullin, we segued into birds, which is pretty exciting. In the first section, we discussed when a weasel bites a bird in its head. So we had discussed different ways of testing to see if the weasel punctured through the brain, through the skull, not just through the skull, but also through the membranes of the brain. One test is to push on its brains through its mouth and apply pressure on the brains and see if any brains squish out of any holes. Another way to check is you check the inner membrane with a needle. You kind of open up the skull, and then you could take a needle or a nail or we even said like a kind of stick of wheat, and you gently kind of slide it on the brain by where the puncture would be and see if it hits a snag. Now, when it comes to aquatic birds, we even said at the end, like a goose, for example, would be considered aquatic birds. Their brain membranes are very, very thin and weak, and therefore we just automatically assume that if the weasel punctures the skull of the aquatic bird, it's automatically treif. We discussed then when a bird falls into fire. So if you check inside the bird and you see that if red organs like the heart, like the liver, like the holy Kurkevan, if they have a green spot, then they are treif. Also, if your intestines get a red spot, they are treif. But the red organs that get a red spot or the intestines that get a green spot, that's fine. And however, if should I say doesn't count? Maybe. So if you find like a green spot on it and it washes off, so then that just means that it was smoke. It wasn't like actually a real green spot. Just editing this. Fine. And it also, of course, works in the other way, that if it looked all red and all good, and then you cook it and it, wait, why am I saying washed? I don't know what I'm washed off. No, if you cook it and there's a green spot, but the green spot comes out, it's fine. But also at the same time, if you cook it and it's all red and it becomes green, it's an indication of a treifa. Fine. Then we got to a new Mishnah, which talked about kosher defects of a bird. And basically at the end, we talked there about if somebody falls off a roof and his guts are spilled out all over the floor, don't manually put them back inside him. Rather, try to somehow get him to get his guts back inside himself. Friends, that was Daf Nun Vav, Daf 56 of Masechta Chulin. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. I'll catch you tomorrow. Cheers.